You're Locked On Blackhawks, your daily podcast on the Chicago Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, Blackhawks fans? Welcome back to another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On today's episode, I'll be reacting to Scott Wheeler's NHL top prospect pool rankings, as well as some recent trade rumors surrounding Blackhawks veteran forward Pat Maroon, and then I'll be rounding things out with an update on the Rockford IceHogs, since our Blackhawks are in the midst of a 2-week break with the Four Nations tournament going on. Quick reminder, everything is always time-coded down in the description on every single episode of Locked On Blackhawks so that you can jump to whatever part of any show you specifically want to listen to. Also, make sure to go and smash that like button, jump in the comment section down below as well. Mailbag Monday is right around the corner. Subscribe to Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube if you haven't done so already. Greatly appreciate everyone out there who helped me reach my goal of 2,000 subscribers before the month of January came to a close, but let's keep those numbers on the rise. And last but certainly not least, got to give a quick shout out to today's sponsor, which is FanDuel. Go and check out FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel Sportsbook app to win $150 worth of bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins with America's #1 sportsbook. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Again, thank you all for joining me on another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, your one-stop shop for all things Chicago Blackhawks. Opening things up on the show here today, let's dive right into Scott Wheeler of The Athletic dropping his NHL top prospect pool rankings earlier on in the week. And no surprise, the Chicago Blackhawks find themselves inside the top 10. I'll be reacting to the top 10 right here on the show and going through where the Blackhawks found themselves in the top 10, as well as some of the prospects that Wheeler made sure to mention. Kicking things off at number 1, no surprise, is the San Jose Sharks. Even though Macklin Celebrini technically is no longer a member of their prospect pool, just like Connor Bedard, of course, is no longer a member of the Blackhawks prospect pool. He's officially an established member of their NHL roster, and that's kind of how Wheeler dictated between prospects or NHLers. If you're officially a certified member of the NHL roster, then you're technically off of this list. So no Macklin Celebrini for the San Jose Sharks, no Connor Bedard for our Blackhawks, but the Sharks still find themselves at number 1 despite not having Celebrini on this list or Shakir Mukhamadullin either. They still have Will Smith, though, leading the charge, as well as Sam Dickinson, who was a first-round pick in last year's draft. They have Yaroslav Askarov in net, who they acquired via trade from the Nashville Predators. They also have Quentin Musty, who, if you Blackhawks fans like myself have been keeping up with the Sudbury Wolves of the Ontario Hockey League to see how Alex Ferrand has been faring over these last couple of seasons, then you easily will see Quentin Musty has absolutely been lighting it up for Sudbury. Then they still have Luca Cagnoni, Philip Bysted, Igor Chernyshov, who was the first pick in the second round of last year's draft. And oh yeah, the Sharks do still have 2 first-round selections in the 2025 NHL draft. So continuing to stockpile young talent alongside Macklin Celebrini. No real gripe from me that San Jose kicks things off here at number 1 on Scott Wheeler's prospect pool rankings. At number 2 is the Minnesota Wild, led by Zeev Buium, who I relished and cherished so much in the 2024 NHL draft. I knew as a left-handed defenseman, 2 was going to be too early for the Blackhawks, but still couldn't believe he slid all the way down to Minnesota in a future pairing with he and Brock Faber, who of course isn't on this list for Minnesota either, is a really scary thing to think about considering the Blackhawks are also in the Central Division. Then the Wild have Daniil Yurov, David Jiricek, who they acquired via trade from Columbus, Jesper Wallstedt, who's just been kind of waiting to jump onto the NHL scene full-time these last couple of years. Liam Ogren was a first-round selection. Riley Heidt, if you've been listening to the show for about 2 years now, going back to the 2023 NHL draft, and you might remember me gassing up Riley Heidt. I absolutely love this kid. Could not believe he fell all the way to being a late second-round selection. I had him ranked as a top 20 prospect, and he's been killing it in the WHL these last couple of years. Marat Kuznetsov is a good prospect for Minnesota as well. Charlie Stramel, former first-round pick. Ryder Ritchie, Aaron Kiviharju, very deep prospect pool for the Minnesota Wild. They might not have that top tier level player like a Macklin Celebrini. I think Zeev Buium is going to be a very good and well-rounded player. I don't know if he's ever going to be like in the top defenseman in the NHL type of category, like, Macklin Celebrini could be as obviously as a forward. So that's probably why I do agree Minnesota is behind San Jose here, even though Macklin Celebrini isn't technically part of this Sharks prospect pool. I think Will Smith is certainly in that category for the Sharks. So I agree, Sharks at 1, 2, with the Minnesota Wild, being at number 2, according to Scott Wheeler. At number 3, not the Chicago Blackhawks, it's the Montreal Canadiens, led by Ivan Demidov, who, if the Blackhawks had selected him number 2 overall, there would sure be a good case that the Blackhawks are number 1 on this list, but didn't end up going that way, unfortunately. The Canadiens not only have Demidov, but they also have Jacob Fowler, a really savvy second round. Maybe he actually might have even went in the third round a couple of years ago. Same draft, the Blackhawks selected Adam Guyan as the first goaltender off the board. That one looks like a little bit of a toughie, but you never know with young goaltenders. Montreal also has David Reinbacher, Michael Hage, who's having an excellent freshman season in college hockey with Michigan, Logan Mailloux, Owen Beck. Pretty sound prospect pool for the Montreal Canadiens. And one thing I should highlight, having Ivan Demidov as a high-level forward, Jacob Fowler as a high-level goalie, and David Reinbacher as a high-level defenseman. Like, they have high-level prospects in all three key positions. There's only 3 positions when you really break it down like that, but they have high-level prospects at all of them. So I understand Montreal being at number 3, despite maybe not being the deepest of prospect pools. And that's where we get to the Chicago Blackhawks at number 4, who I believe have probably the deepest prospect pool, probably right there with Minnesota and San Jose, in my opinion. Even without Connor Bedard, they still have Artem Levshinov, who I know a lot of Blackhawks fans kind of have this disdain for because he's not Ivan Demidov. I understand that, but I still believe Artem Levshinov is going to be a very solid right-handed defenseman that has a lot of excellent tools, as I've talked about time and time again on the show. Then Wheeler also made sure to mention Frank Nazar, Kevin Korchinski, Sam Renzel, Sasha Boisvert, Marek Vanacker. I loved how he had Nick Lardis on this list as well. Oliver Moore, Roman Kanserov, Ethan Del Mastro, like a very, very sound top 10 to the Blackhawks prospect pool. And Wheeler even mentioned the depth that the Blackhawks do have, saying some of the guys who didn't even crack the top 15 would easily be inside the top 15 or even the top 10 in most of these other teams' prospect pools. So the depth is something that really stands out with the Blackhawks. They don't have that high-level stud, all-star caliber type of player, game breaker like a Connor Bedard, even though Levshinov is highly thought of, and I feel the same way. One thing I've talked about is just the questionable level of upside, because none of the great tools that he possesses are necessarily elite. So that's why I do understand the Blackhawks being at number 4 here without Connor Bedard. With Connor Bedard, I think they're easily number 1 or number 2, just kind of how you want to debate San Jose versus the Blackhawks at that point in time, in my opinion. But understand the Blackhawks coming at number 4. They definitely have the deeper prospect pool compared to the Montreal Canadiens, but I think the Canadiens have the higher level upside in their top prospects. At number 5 is the Detroit Red Wings with Stevie Yzerman, led by Axel Sandin Pellikka, who has been excellent at the World Juniors the last couple of years. Michael Brandzeg-Nygaard, who was like the most Detroit pick ever in the first round of last year's draft, along with Marco Kasper, Nate Danielson, who's having a pretty good first pro year, maybe not as high level as I thought it was going to be, but still very young in the development process, and a prospect I really thought high of. Sebastian Cossa in net, along with Trey Augustine. Not a deep prospect pool, but a good prospect pool still for the Red Wings. And even though there are some questions about the Yzer plan, there's still more help coming on the way. Obviously, Detroit and their fans would have liked this to transpire a little bit faster here, but still some good pieces coming on the way for the Red Wings these next few years. At number 6 is the Columbus Blue Jackets. No Adam Fantilli or Kent Johnson, I should point out. They have Caden Lindstrom, Denton Matichuk, Jordan Dumais, and Gavin Brindley. Not a real deep prospect pool, and honestly, I think Columbus might be a little overrated here. Outside of Caden Lindstrom, this isn't really a prospect pool I think all that highly of. At number 7 is the Utah Hockey Club. No Logan Cooley or Dylan Guenther. If they had both of those guys, they'd easily be inside the top 5. But they still have Tija Ginla, Dmitry Simashev, and Daniil Boot, both kind of questionable first-round selections a couple of years ago, but still intriguing prospects for them. Maverick Lamoureux, Michael Horabel, who's been really good in college hockey these last couple of years. Cole Baudouin was a first-round selection this past season. I'd probably have Utah over Columbus, but I understand with Caden Lindstrom, I do have Lindstrom above Tija Ginla, but I'd rather have Utah's prospect pool than Columbus's if we're excluding Adam Fantilli or Kent Johnson. At number 8 is the Nashville Predators, who honestly, this prospect pool doesn't really entice me all that much. Tanner Molendyk has some good qualities, yes. Matthew Wood is probably the prospect I personally like the most. Outside of that, it's David Edstrom, who they acquired via trade, Zachary Leroux, who's literally one of my least favorite hockey players out there. If you know, you know. And then Joakim Kamel, who actually, I believe, just made his NHL debut against the Blackhawks prior to the Four Nations break. But not a really impressive prospect pool, in my opinion, for the Predators. I don't think I'd have them in the top 10. I definitely have the team at number 9, the Washington Capitals, ahead of them. I know they don't have the deepest prospect pool either, but Ryan Leonard, Andrew Crystal, Cole Hudson, Tarek Paraskak was a prospect I was really intrigued by in the 2024 NHL draft. Again, maybe they don't have the high-level bodies like some of the teams ahead of them, but there's definitely upside from the guys that they have there. Ryan Leonard's been dynamite since he's been drafted. I'd have the Washington Capitals personally ahead of the Nashville Predators. And then rounding things out, according to Scott Wheeler, at number 10 is the Seattle Kraken, led by Berkeley Catton, who, man, I raved about Berkeley Catton in the 2024 draft. And I know it was crazy, and I think the world of this guy, clearly, as you could tell by my backdrop. But Berkeley Catton really reminded me of a 17, 18-year-old Patrick Kane, the way that he plays the game and recognizes what's going on. It's almost like he's knows what's going to happen before the play even goes on. Like, he's reading plays so well. He knows where the open ice is, knows how to find trailers going into the offensive zone. Really good skill set. I like Berkeley Catton a lot. They also have Carson Rakoff, Jager, I'm honestly not familiar with him. Jager Furcus, not the most familiar. Maybe that's shame on me. Don't know ball type of moment. They also have Edward Chalet, Ty Nelson. I like Berkeley Catton more than Ryan Leonard, more than Matthew Wood. Like, Seattle, maybe not deep, but Berkeley Catton is going to be a sleeper, and I think he's going to be a really good player for that organization for a long, long time. But there are my thoughts on Scott Wheeler releasing his top NHL prospect pool rankings, and the Blackhawks coming in at number 4. Let me know what you thought of Wheeler's top 10 down below in the comment section, and the Blackhawks slotting in at number 4. Was their ranking too high, too low? Who else do you think Wheeler had too high or too low? Give me your full 2 cents down below in the comment section. Coming up in just a moment, when I return, Blackhawks fans, I'll discuss some of the recent trade rumors going on surrounding veteran forward Pat Maroon. But first, I got to talk to you all real quick about Indeed. You just realized your business needed to hire someone like yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Well, it's easy. Just use Indeed. Because when it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other sites, because Indeed sponsored job posts puts your post at the top of the page and helps you reach the right candidates faster. They make sure your post is seen by the right candidates right now, so you can skip all of those unnecessary questions and steps that other websites ask you, because now you can speed up your hiring process and get a $75 sponsored job credit by just going to Indeed.com/lockedon. Again, that's Indeed.com/lockedon right now, and make sure to show our show support by saying you heard about Indeed on this very podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? Then you need Indeed. Segment 2, some recent Pat Maroon trade rumors have caught the scene in the last couple of days, coming from Jeff Merrick of the Daily Faceoff, which shouldn't really be all that surprising, Blackhawks fans, considering where the team is at. And you would think Maroon, being 36 years old at this stage of his career and all the winning he's done, I'm sure he loves doing all that winning, as a lot of people do in the NHL, especially veterans whose clock's ticking a little bit. And I know Maroon would want to get back to that opportunity. And quite honestly, Blackhawks fans, when he signed on with this team in the offseason, inking a one-year deal at $1.3 million, knowing those are the terms, very low AAV. Blackhawks, odds of them making the Stanley Cup playoffs, even though the roster, maybe we overvalued some of the moves that they brought in. It was certainly improving. Did not think they were going to be making the Stanley Cup playoffs, though. Obviously, players are not talking about that type of stuff in the locker room, and there's no kind of belief like that in an NHL clubhouse or anything. But I think Pat Maroon knew what he was doing, and likely signing a one-year deal with the Blackhawks meant he was likely going to be traded at the NHL trade deadline. So not the most surprising thing in the world to hear Jeff Merrick on Daily Faceoff bring up some potential rumors surrounding Maroon, saying, quote, "I imagine Chicago's Pat Maroon will be on the move by NHL trade deadline, with a few teams out there looking for toughness along with rings in the room," which teams are always looking for. Maroon checks both of those boxes. If you're Tampa, do you consider a reunion knowing you'll probably have to go through the Florida Panthers at some point in the playoffs? And I think that's a very good point that Jeff Merrick brings up, because the Florida Panthers, they play with that grit. They play with that sandpaper. They got a lot of big boys on the back end and in that forward group, including the pest himself, Matthew Tkachuk, who gets under players' skin maybe better than anyone else in the entire NHL. And, oh yeah, he can play a point per game level skill game as well. Very, very talented player who's really, I think, fully burst onto the scene. Obviously, winning a Stanley Cup helps with that, since joining on with the Florida Panthers, and the Tampa Bay Lightning with the spot that they're in. At some point, you think they're going to have to go toe-to-toe with the fellow Florida NHL club, Florida Panthers. So a Pat Maroon reunion, I do think makes sense. But Blackhawks fans, if you remember from their meeting just a couple of weeks ago, might not have even been all that long ago, there were 2 meetings between the Lightning and the Blackhawks within 8 or 9 days, 2 very close meetings. And the second game down in Tampa got super chippy, and Pat Maroon was giving it to the Tampa Bay Lightning bench. Now, maybe, and I'm sure it is one of those things that would blow over very easily if Pat Maroon were to be traded back to the Lightning, and a team that he's very familiar with. John Cooper, still the coach there. I'm sure he has a good relationship with Coop. I'm sure Maroon would still be willing to go to the Tampa Bay Lightning. I just thought that would be interesting considering what went down the last time those two teams played. But yeah, I'm sure there's going to be plenty of suitors for a guy like Pat Maroon. As Jeff Merrick pointed out, guy with rings, who's been there, done that, very respected veteran leader who plays a rugged game that is what you want come playoff time. Like, I understand why Pat Maroon would be attractive, especially on an expiring contract at only $1.13 million. And from a Blackhawks perspective, even though Pat Maroon, yeah, he only has 13 points or whatever it may be. I think he has 3 goals, 10 assists, and 50 games of action, 49, 50 games, something along those lines. Yeah, the offense maybe, honestly, it's actually pretty good for what I was expecting out of Pat Maroon. And yeah, it would stink to lose his veteran leadership, and he's established a really nice relationship with Lukas Reichel. He had Reichel over with the family for Christmas, right? There was that cute photo of Reichel along with Pat Maroon's kids. So yeah, it would stink to lose Pat Maroon, and I'm sure he's a big part of that locker room, even though it hasn't led to a lot of victories on the ice for the Blackhawks. It would stink to lose him, and he's been really good on the ice as well, along with Lukas Reichel and Craig Smith. But honestly, just from a numbers perspective, something I've said on the show a lot this year, especially since, Landon Slaggert's been called up, Colton, Dach, Frank Nazar. There's a clear-cut youth movement going on with the Blackhawks here down the stretch of the season, naturally so, being well out of playoff contention, right? It just seems like they have, even though injuries do happen, Jason Dickinson's out right now, it still feels like they have one body too many down there in that bottom 6. And just kind of looking at the lineup prior to the break, even with Dickinson out, like Slaggert, Bedard, Donato, Teravainen, and Nazar, Mikheyev, Kurashev, Foligno, Bertuzzi, Maroon, Reichel, Smith. Colton Dach's going to come back up at some point, and yeah, I know Philip Kurashev is basically blacklisted, and it would be easy to just slot him as the extra forward, but I still think you got to wonder if Cole Gutman is the guy that's ever going to get a call up. I know he's fallen out of favor as a little bit of an older prospect, but he's a near point per game guy once again down with the Rockford IceHogs, and the Blackhawks could use some center depth. I would honestly like to see Lukas Reichel move from the center to the wing now that he has some confidence going. I know maybe changing positions necessarily isn't the best thing to do, but I still think Reichel is naturally a wing, and I would like to get him some opportunities there. The problem is the Blackhawks just don't have the center depth, especially with Jason Dickinson out of the lineup, but it feels inevitable that one of Pat Maroon and Craig Smith, and honestly, I wouldn't even be surprised if both of them were to get traded. I think only one getting dealt is the more likely option, but I think Pat Maroon is very, very likely to get traded come trade deadline time. Very easy contract to move, very attractive trade piece. From the Blackhawks numbers perspective, I think it makes sense to be giving Colton Dach those opportunities down the stretch on the fourth line. Plays a similar-ish type of game, and he's been knocking on the door for these opportunities. So, yeah, Pat Maroon getting traded. I think that's no surprise that I'm talking about that, but did want to get into what Jeff Marek had to say. Definitely wanted to point out the Tampa Bay Lightning is an interesting little tidbit out there. And I'll make sure to bring up any more trade rumors involving Pat Maroon. If there's any links to any teams, I'll bring it up right here on Locked On Blackhawks. But there's the latest that we have on veteran forward Pat Maroon with the trade deadline approaching. Coming up in just a moment before I close out today's episode, Blackhawks fans, still got to get into a quick update on the Rockford IceHogs. But first, I got to talk to you all about the fine folks over at FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on the action than with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because with FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay right in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. And as my followers on X have probably seen, I love to parlay an anytime goal scorer with the historic data of the over-unders in a certain matchup, but there's loads of options for whatever you would like to place a wager on. And right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So just go and visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel Sportsbook app in order to join today. Again, that's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. So make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you all for making Locked On Blackhawks your very first listen. Here to start off your day. For your second listen, make sure to go and check out the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast so that you can become a fantasy hockey expert and get the edge over your league mates with daily tips from Steal and Flip. And you can easily find the link to Locked On Fantasy Hockey right now on YouTube or wherever you may be listening to your podcasts. Segment 3, with the Blackhawks in the midst of their 2-week break with the Four Nations tournament going on, I thought it would be a very fitting time to get into a little bit of an update on the Rockford IceHogs and talk about how things have been going down in the AHL. And it hasn't been very pretty for the IceHogs this year, who have been through a lot, as I've talked about a couple of different times on the show, with Anders Sorensen having to be called up to the big leagues. Mark Eaton comes from out of the Blackhawks front office with zero coaching experience. Yeah, I know he's a guy they're super high on, but still, no coaching experience under his belt ever. He's now the head coach of the Rockford IceHogs. Hasn't necessarily led to the best results, I think, naturally. The IceHogs are 17-21-5 through their opening of 44 games. Again, a reminder that the AHL works on a 72-game season, so still 28 games left in the year for the IceHogs. I actually believe they're in action again tonight, but that currently has them in 5th place in the AHL's Central Division. AHL postseason, the Calder Cup playoffs, very, very wonky formatting. It's been the same, I think, the last 4 years now. For the Central Division, 5 teams get in, but the 4th and 5th seeds have a play-in best of 3 in order to play the 1 seed in the next round. So the goal is really to get one of the top 3 seeds in the regular season. Doesn't look like the IceHogs are going to be gunning for that, though, because at this point in time, like I said, they sit 5th, but they're 10 points back of 4th place. But on the bright side, they are 7 points ahead of 6th place. So kind of a lot of hockey to be played, but a little landlocked in that number 5 spot right now. No surprise, the Texas Stars lead the way at number 1, as they always seem to be. Grand Rapids Griffins sit at number 2. The Milwaukee Admirals are at number 3. How about the Chicago Wolves bouncing back at number 4? That puts the Rockford IceHogs at number 5. As I said, 10 points back of Chicago at number 4, but 7 points ahead of the Iowa Wild at number 6, and then the Manitoba Moose rounding things out at number 7. And of course, Ethan Del Mastro and Colton Dach both were reassigned to the Rockford IceHogs prior to the Blackhawks going on this 2-week break. Dach was actually sent down with a couple of games remaining. He went back down to Rockford prior to the Blackhawks. Back-to-back over the weekend, Ethan Del Mastro was sent down yesterday morning. Little interesting that neither Landon Slaggard nor Frankie Nazar went down to the AHL to get some reps while the Blackhawks are on a little bit of a pause. But I think for Nazar, it makes a little bit more sense considering the amount of game reps he's gotten. And he's been up at the NHL scene for a little bit longer. Landon Slaggard hasn't been here for quite as long, so I think that was a little interesting, but maybe it's telling that they think he's kind of a full-time NHLer at this point. And he's certainly looked the part, albeit in a small sample size, but Landon Slaggard, I think, has looked better than any of us have anticipated here so far in his second NHL stint. But I wanted to get into the IceHogs lineup a little bit that they are going with here this evening. Colton Dach, Cole Gutman, and Samuel Savoie serving as the top line. Cole Gutman, the leading scorer for the IceHogs this year, as I mentioned a moment ago, nearly a point per game pace. I do wonder if the Blackhawks are going to give him an opportunity here down the stretch, just because they really do need some center depth, especially with Dickinson out at the moment. Gutman has 43 points, 20 goals, 23 assists, and 44 AHL games. He's basically been a point per game guy for Rockford every time he's been there the last 3 years now. Doesn't really have much left to prove at that level, but again, has fallen out of favor as an older prospect. Colton Dach's been really sound with the IceHogs this year as well. 26 points, 12 goals, 14 assists in 32 games. Sorensen said he was a little disappointed with the lack of physicality out of Colton Dach. I honestly didn't really see that. I thought he was pretty physical for a guy in his first stint, but maybe they just want him to be an absolute rabid dog jackass to play out there. And in his first couple of games back with Rockford, he was certainly doing that. So you could tell he's a guy who wants to get called back up to the show, and I think that's going to happen sooner rather than later. Also wanted to shout out Samuel Savoie, who has 13 points, 5 goals, 8 assists in 44 games in his first pro season. Providing more offense, especially, I know it's only 8 assists in 44 games, but I really didn't think he was going to be putting up those types of numbers right away. Again, not that it's like blowing anything to write home about, incredible, but compared to Paul Lewicki, who only has 4 points, 3 goals, and 1 assist in his first 37 AHL games, like, that's surprising. I thought Lewicki was going to be the guy who had a little bit more playmaking ability than Savoie. Both are very similar, goonish types of players, but Savoie, the one flashing more offensive upside at this point in time. Also, Andreas Athanasiou, sometimes I forget he's even still a part of this organization. He's probably got to be sitting out in Rockford, like wondering, like, what the hell? How did I get here? But he's got 10 points, 5 goals, and 5 assists in his opening 11 AHL games. Wonder if the Blackhawks are going to give him an opportunity at all, if they're just going to let his contract expire and send him on his way. On defense, did want to talk Artem Levshinov, now has 15 points, 3 goals, 12 assists in 41 games as a 19-year-old in the AHL. Like, really nothing to bat an eye at there. And I know it hasn't been flawless, perfect, or what Ivan Demidov is doing in the KHL, but we're kind of comparing apples to oranges here, so everyone should hold their horses a little bit. Last but certainly not least, wanted to talk about the AHL All-Star Game MVP. Shout out to Kevin Korchinski, baby. Really good showing for the Blackhawks and the IceHogs in the AHL All-Star Game. 19 points, 2 goals, and 17 assists in 37 games for Korch. Wonder if we're going to see him at some point down the stretch of the season. Not that there's really room for the Blackhawks with their current decor. And then Drew Commesso. Can't forget about him. 8-12-2 record. 896 save percentage. 295 goals against. Hasn't been pretty. But at the same point in time, the blue line ahead of him has kind of been a disaster. The Rockford IceHogs as a whole has been a disaster. It's a pretty young and inexperienced group for the most part. They're not as veteran heavy on the forward group like they were the last couple of years. The blue line hasn't been as established. Everything's been kind of jumbled and a little bit of a circus for the Rockford IceHogs. So again, I'm going to give Drew Commesso a little bit of slack and not going to give an overreaction to a guy who's not performing the best in the best situation. sounds like what Arvid Soderblom was doing these last couple of years. And listen, that's not to say that's absolutely what's going to happen to Drew Commesso, but I think we should just keep in mind not to panic over these types of numbers. And he's going to be back in Rockford regardless next year, considering the Hawks still have Laurent Brossoit, Arvid Soderblom, and Peter Mrazek all under contract. So that's going to wrap up today's episode of Locked On Blackhawks, everyone. As always, thank you all again for joining me on the show. Be sure to go and subscribe to Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube if you haven't done so already. Help me out. It's the best way that you can show some support. And if you want to catch the show on the go, whether you're driving to or from work or on your lunch break, can go and follow Locked On Blackhawks for free wherever you may be listening to your podcasts. Until next time, everyone, enjoy the rest of your Tuesdays. I'll see you next time on the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.